It's the stuff dreams are made of. Almost more than setting foot on another worldly body is man's ability to harness the power to get there. The first rockets were invented by the Chinese more than 1,000 years ago. A byproduct of their invention of gunpowder, rockets were used to add extra flair to fireworks displays. It was inevitable that these far-reaching projectiles would eventually take on militaristic applications. William Congreve, a British officer, developed a rocket for use against Napoleon in 1806. Congreve's rockets eventually achieved immortality in 1814 when 35-year-old poet and lawyer Francis Scott Key wrote about the rocket's red glare in his composition of the United States national anthem. Because the accuracy of these early rockets was notoriously bad, their use declined, especially as advancements were made in the use of artillery. However, they were not forgotten. As many looked to the stars, they knew that in time, rockets would take them there.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
President Kennedy's speech to a special joint session of Congress in May of 1961 set the world on fire with space fever. While still reeling from a major humiliation in the Bay of Pigs debacle, Kennedy's latest goal of sending a man to the moon gave Americans a new focus with respect to an old rival, the Soviet Union.
Just try pushing Americans around and you'll get just about as far as the creek. Sure, you find a few suckers here and there, the kind of guys that live by letting George do it. But you aren't gonna fool anybody who knows anything about you and remember some of those tricks you pulled over the last 30 years. And there's more than enough of us to take care of you.
Political tensions between the two superpowers kept the fires of competition burning. It was clear to all this was going to be a close race. The Russians, in many respects, were already in the lead.
The communists recognize education as a powerful social force and have exploited it to the full as an instrument of indoctrination. Their emphasis today is placed on technical, scientific, and practical training.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union changed history when it successfully launched Sputnik 1. This basketball-sized artificial satellite weighed all of 183 pounds and took slightly longer than 90 minutes to complete a full orbit of the Earth. Although the plans were well underway for an American satellite launch, Sputnik caught everyone off guard. The Russian success immediately spawned public fears in the U.S. as to the communist country's ability to reach American soil with a long-range missile attack. One American woman interviewed on the street that evening stated simply, "We fear this." Giving the Americans no time to catch up, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 in November of 1957. But instead of simply repeating their recent success, the Russians made Sputnik 2 into another first by carrying a living payload in Sputnik 1. Werner von Braun and his team were immediately set to work on the Explorer project, intended to send an American satellite into space. Their first attempt to launch ended in an explosion of the satellite while still on the launch pad. Von Braun pointed out that America's first satellite weighed a mere 4 pounds, an insignificant amount when compared to the Soviets' 196-pound Sputnik 2. "We're competing only in spirit," said von Braun. His disappointment, however, would not last for long. By January of 1958, the tides began to turn in the race for space when the U.S. successfully launched Explorer 1.
The National Science Foundation announced that as part of the U.S. International Geophysical Year program, a scientific Earth satellite was placed in orbit at 5 seconds after 10:55 p.m. by means of a Jupiter C rocket vehicle launched by the Army at Cape Canaveral, Florida. A similar statement is being issued by the President. I should like to add my personal congratulations to the Army Ballistic Missiles Agency and to Dr. von Braun and Dr. Pickering and their colleagues for a job well done.
This diminutive satellite carried a scientific payload that, in short course, discovered a series of magnetic radiation belts circling the Earth. While not a glamorous discovery, it served as a stepping stone in the birth of scientific satellite exploration. 1958 in America also saw the birth of the National Aeronautics and Space Act that ultimately led to the creation of NASA from parts of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and other related government agencies. In response to the seeming success of Sputnik 2, the U.S. Army next launched the Jupiter AM-13 rocket on December 13, 1958. Inside the rocket, the world's first monkey knot. Gordo, a delightful little squirrel monkey, was reported to have done well during the flight. However, after a successful re-entry, Gordo drowned in the Atlantic Ocean when the rocket's flotation device failed and the spacecraft sank. Next, 2 monkeys named Abel and Baker rode into the heavens in May of 1959. Both returned and were retrieved successfully. And then there was Ham, probably America's most famous monkey knot. Launched into suborbital flight on January 31, 1961. He flew in a Mercury spacecraft from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Ham experienced roughly 7 minutes of weightlessness during his flight. While in flight, Ham performed some simple tasks, such as pulling a right-hand lever when a white light came on and a left-hand lever when a blue light came on. The experiment was designed so that he could be rewarded with banana pellets for making the correct choice, but would receive an electric shock through his feet for an incorrect choice. Ham's rocket did experience a number of anomalies. As a result, his spacecraft splashed down in the ocean and took on water before the rescue helicopters arrived. Luckily, he was recovered without harm. Afterwards, Ham seemed to be in good spirits as he posed for pictures with the sailors on the recovery ship. It seemed the American space program was beginning to see some light. But despite America's advances, the Russians seemed to be unstoppable. From 1958 through 1961, they launched 6 more Earth-orbiting Sputniks. Each successive launch was much larger and heavier than the one before it, and techniques were improving in the areas of re-entry and recovery. It was clear the Russians were preparing to put a man into space. On October 4, 1959, just 2 years after the launch of Sputnik 1, the Soviets launched Luna 3, the first spacecraft to fly around the moon. Luna 3, however, didn't just orbit the moon. It actually sent back images of the moon's dark side, giving Earth the first glimpse of the heavenly body's uncharted territory. Next for the Russians, Ivan. Ivan was a life-sized mannequin dressed in the Soviet SK-1 spacesuit and enclosed in the Soviet-made Vostok spacecraft. Ivan's trip into space gave the Russian program the critical information it needed to launch their next passenger. On April 12, 1961, Red Army Major Yuri Gagarin became the first human to fly in outer space. A devoted husband and father of two, Gagarin was just 27 years old when he reached the stars. His accomplishments stunned the world and made him a Russian national hero. Just minutes before Gagarin flew into the vastness of outer space, he wrote these words.
Dear friends, both known and unknown to me, fellow Russians and people of all countries and continents. In a few minutes, a mighty spaceship will carry me into the faraway expanses of space. What can I say to you in these last minutes before the start? At this instant, the whole of my life seems to be condensed into one wonderful moment. Everything I have experienced and done till now has been in preparation for this moment. You must realize that it is hard to express my feeling now that the test for which we have been training long and passionately is at hand. I don't have to tell you what I felt when it was suggested that I should make this flight, the first in history. Was it joy? No, it was something more than that. Pride? No, it was not just pride. I felt great happiness. To be the first to enter the cosmos, to engage single-handed in an unprecedented duel with nature. Could anyone dream of anything greater than that? Major Yuri Gagarin, USSR.
Gagarin's words, while stemmed in a certain pride for his nation, reached across borders and oceans in the spirit of peaceful exploration. While the Russians gained yet another first, it ultimately succeeded as a first for not just one country, but for all of mankind. But just a few days later, the glimmer of hope that Gagarin expressed in his letter was overshadowed by a clash on the coast of Cuba. The Bay of Pigs, an attempt by the American military and the Central Intelligence Agency to topple the communist regime of Fidel Castro, ended in defeat and humiliation for the American government and ultimately for the American people. Morale in the land of freedom was now at an all-time low. Despite the emotional climate in the U.S. in May of 1961, President Kennedy held the perfect trump card in his pocket.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
It seems that even while the Russians continued to beat the Americans on every front in space, the Americans had a secret goal. The primary focus for the space program all along had been to be the first to put a man on the moon. Kennedy had been willing to take his lumps early on, confident that his ultimate goal would be achieved within the decade.
and to the world. These 7 men who have been selected to begin training for orbital space flight. Which of these men will be first to orbit the Earth, I cannot tell you. He won't know himself until the day of the flight. The astronaut training program will last probably 2 years. During this time, our urgent goal is to subject these gentlemen to every stress, each unusual environment they will experience in that flight.
Called astronauts, as ballooning pioneers had been called argonauts, pilots Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grissom, Schirra, Shepard, and Slayton were thrust into the public eye. 7 Americans willing to risk their lives in the name of science, exploration, and freedom. Project Mercury introduced the world to a new kind of celebrity. Now, the pride of an entire nation lay on the shoulders of these 7 brave pilots. A number of unmanned flights were included as part of the Mercury program. These flights tested various capabilities of the Mercury ground crew and of the Mercury spacecrafts. Such missions included the testing of abort and escape capabilities, booster and suborbital operations. 20 unmanned missions in all were completed, each with the ultimate goal of putting an American astronaut into space. Then on May 5th, 1961 at 9:34 a.m., test pilot and astronaut Alan B. Shepard Jr. lifted off from the launch pad at Cape Canaveral.
Cape Canaveral, Florida, May 5th, 1961. U.S. Mercury astronaut Alan B. Shepard enters his spacecraft. Very shortly, he will be on his way into space. As the hatch goes on, 2 big questions come to your mind. Is the vehicle ready? Are you ready? Before the flight, Shepard had this to say.
I think the one thing that strikes me as I look back on the training program is that I have really developed a feeling of confidence. A confidence in the people with whom I work, a confidence in the systems with which I am dealing and will have to deal in flight, and of course, a confidence in myself.
Ready to resume the count? Roger, ready to resume the count. STE, I'm going to turn it over to Stoney, verify. Resume the count. Okay, Stoney, take it over. Roger. 5 seconds. 7, Stoney, on you. 7, loud and clear, Stoney. Roger, loud and clear, also. 1 minute and counting. Roger. Bearing command. 30, mark. Roger, periscope has retracted. That's confirmed periscope to cut. Main bus 24 volts, 26 amps. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All right, lift off and the clock is started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear. This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go, 1.2 G. Cabin at 14 PSI. Oxygen is go.
Traveling at a speed of 5,134 miles per hour, more than 4 times faster than the speed of sound, Shepard hurled into the air in spacecraft number 7 under the power of the MR-7 rocket.
2.5 G. Cabin 5.5. Oxygen is go. The main bus is 24, and the isolated battery is 29. 7 here. Fuel is go. 4G. 5.5 cabin. Oxygen go. All systems are go.
He shot 116.5 miles into the atmosphere and covered a distance of 303 miles in just 15 minutes and 28 seconds. After years of dreaming and hard work, America had finally put a man into space.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to express on behalf of us all The great pleasure we have in welcoming Commander Shepard and Mrs. Shepard here today. And I think it does credit to him that he is associated with such a distinguished group of Americans whom we are all glad to honor today, his companions in the flight to outer space. They are the tanned and healthy ones. The others are Washington employees.
A few months later, astronaut Virgil Gus Grissom became the second American to visit the vastness of outer space. His flight lasted just 9 seconds longer than Shepard's flight. However, it was not simply a repeat of America's first manned success. The main difference between Liberty Bell 7 and its forerunner, the Mercury 7, was the addition of a large viewing window and an explosively activated side hatch on the spacecraft. The large window was added at the request of the Mercury astronauts to provide for a better view than that offered from a small side port. The explosive hatch could be activated from inside the spacecraft or from the outside by the use of a pull string. Upon a successful splashdown in the Atlantic, the exit hatch blew prematurely, allowing seawater to flow inside. Grissom escaped the spacecraft and swam the Atlantic for more than 4 minutes as the helicopters above tried to save the sinking Liberty Bell spacecraft. Soon, though, the weight of the sinking craft became too much for the chopper to bear. Rescue lines were cut and Liberty Bell 7 sank 15,000 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Grissom was later exonerated of any wrongdoing. However, the memory of the mishap followed him for some time. Even with 2 manned space flights, America had relatively little time logged in outer space, and an American had yet to orbit the Earth. That all changed, however, on February 20th, 1962, when John Glenn, a pilot from Ohio, became the first American to orbit the Earth, following in the footsteps of cosmonaut Gagarin, who had become the first human to do it less than 1 year before.
To start ETI on my mark. Roger. Minus 3, 2, 1, mark. Roger, ETI is minus 45. Minus 40. Status check, pressurization. Locks taking. Have a blinking high level light. You are go. Motor systems. Go. Range operations. Mercury capsule. No. All pre-start pilot lights are correct. The ready light is on. Eject Mercury umbilical. Oil evacuate. Mercury umbilical clear. Mercury evacuate. Lights on. All recorders to fast. T-minus 18 seconds and counting engine start. You know the way must be wicked, Thomas. Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Glenn's flight lasted a total of 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds. He orbited the Earth a total of 3 times.
Roger. Retros are firing. Oh, Roger, baby. Are they ever? It feels like I'm going back toward Hawaii. Don't do that. You want to go on the East Coast. Roger. Fire retro light is green. Roger. Roger, retros have stopped. 100 to keep your retro tack on until you pass Texas. That's affirmative. This is Friendship 7. I think the pack just let go. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside. Friendship 7, over. 7, this is Cape. Do you read, over? Green, shoot is out in race condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful shoot. Shoot looks good. On O2 emergency and the shoot looks very good. Rate of descent has gone to about 42 feet per second. The shoot looks very good. Hello, Mercury recovery. This is Friendship 7. Do you receive?
Lieutenant Colonel John H. Glenn, Jr., United States Marine Corps.
I'm certainly glad to see that pride in our country and its accomplishments are not a thing of the past.
Astronauts M. Scott Carpenter and Walter Schirra Jr. followed Glenn into space with successive orbits of the Earth. Then, on May 15, 1963, Mercury astronaut Gordon Cooper became the first man to spend more than a full day in outer space. Cooper flew his spacecraft around the planet a total of 22 times. His flight lasted 34 hours, 19 minutes, and 49 seconds. With 6 actual manned missions, Project Mercury had run its course. It had provided America with much-needed information on man's ability to survive and work in space. But more important to some, the Mercury project had finally leveled the playing field with the Russians. January of 1962 saw the birth of the NASA twins, or the Gemini project, named for its twin-seat capsule. Designed as an interim project between that of Mercury and the Apollo missions, Gemini's objectives were as clear-cut as those of the Mercury program. Subject man and equipment to space flights up to 2 weeks in duration, rendezvous and dock with orbiting vehicles, and maneuver the docked combination by using the target vehicle's propulsion system, and perfect methods of entering the atmosphere and landing at a pre-selected point on land. It was clear that NASA was raising the stakes in their race to the moon. But while Gemini was forging forward with some lofty goals, the Russians were doing anything but resting on their past accomplishments. In March of 1962, 5 women joined the original detachment at the Soviet Cosmonaut Training Center, officially breaking the gender barrier in future space exploration activities. Between August 11th and August 12th of 1962, 2 Russian capsules lifted off from Earth, each carrying a human payload. On August 12th, the 2 spacecraft passed within 7 kilometers of one another. The 2 craft made radio and visual contact before drifting slowly apart. Another first for the Soviet space program. However, in addition to some much publicized successes, the Soviets also experienced a number of secret failures. Early attempts to soft land a camera module on the lunar surface ended in frustrating disappointment and the loss of a number of expensive spacecrafts. But while the Russians were experiencing some embarrassing and secretive losses, Gemini was moving forward, slowly. And then...
We interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin from Dallas, Texas. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade.
November 22nd, 1963. Rifle shots roared through the air over Daley Plaza in Dallas, Texas.
Memorial Hospital. I am at the hospital. Fitzgerald Kennedy is dead.
Their target? The man many consider to be the space program's greatest advocate. The man responsible for setting America ablaze with space fever. The man, John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, was dead, and a great nation was now reeling from the loss. Vice President Johnson assumed command of the country almost immediately. Upon doing so, he made it very clear that his new administration would make space exploration a priority. However, he shifted the struggle for a leadership position in space to that of an individual struggle, stating publicly that he would make it a personal responsibility to ensure that the United States did not fall behind in the space race. He also emphasized the critical importance of technological achievements in space, scientific discovery, military and social reward, and economic stimulus benefits for the country. All of these models for achievement were made high priorities in the Johnson space program beyond the singular goal of landing a man on the moon. It was clear to many that Johnson's goal was one of peaceful unity among mankind in this new frontier. For the first time, humans could see their home planet from space. These images did much to soften the us versus them mentality, but it by no means meant the competition was over. In April of 1964, just 6 months after the tragic loss of President Kennedy, Project Gemini launched its first unmanned rocket. The second unmanned Gemini test flight didn't follow for some months due to the hurricane conditions around the Cape in Florida. Finally, on March 23, 1965, astronauts Grissom and Young piloted a two-man capsule into space and back again. It was a great coup for the American space program. But the Russians continued to surprise and fascinate the world. In October of 1964, Vladimir Komarov, Boris Yegorov, and Konstantin Feoktisov flew Voskhod 1, the first three-manned mission in space. Then in March of 1965, cosmonauts Pavel Belayev and Alexei Leonov flew Voskhod 2 for the Russian space program. Once again, the Soviets amazed the Americans when cosmonaut Leonov became the first man to exit his spacecraft while still in orbit. The spacewalk lasted only 20 minutes, and since his spacesuit had expanded somewhat, Leonov actually had to release air from his suit in order to re-enter his spacecraft. The Gemini project wasn't without its mishaps either. In March of 1966, astronauts Armstrong and Scott were testing a maneuvering thruster aboard Gemini 8 when they experienced a thruster malfunction that sent the spacecraft tumbling into the vastness of outer space. Armstrong and Scott were able to use their re-entry thrusters to regain control of the craft, demonstrating the ability of the astronauts to think quickly, improvise, and adapt to adverse conditions. However, it was a setback the mission never expected. The two astronauts were nearly lost forever. America didn't log its first spacewalk until June of that same year.
30. Looking. Perfect. Predicted cutoff time, 11 plus 37.
The Gemini missions were considered a great success. Each manned flight carried 2 astronauts and were the first to use a hydrogen fuel cell to generate electricity in the spacecraft. Additionally, Gemini astronauts performed the first orbital rendezvous and docking, essential to landing a man on the moon. In 1966, by the time the Gemini program ended, America was catching up with or even surpassing the Russians in many areas of the race for the dominance in space. Designed specifically to send men to the moon and return them safely to Earth, the Apollo program in 1966 was considered the largest scientific and technological undertaking in history. Launched by the 3-stage Saturn V rocket, the 3,000-ton mechanism produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The Apollo spacecraft was composed of 3 sections: the command module, the service module, and the lunar module. In total, it could carry 3 men to the moon and back, with room to spare for collectibles from the lunar surface. No longer was the ability to land a man on the moon just a dream or even a distant possibility. It was a conspicuous reality, and the Apollo program was going to bring it to fruition. To the astronauts, Apollo was the reward for so many years of hard work, dedication, and patience. While there were new experiences to be had with Apollo, much of what the astronauts were required to do was, in some ways, old hat. Pre-flight tests and checks were all things they had done in some way, shape, or form with Mercury and Gemini. And while each of the program missions had experienced setbacks, nothing could prepare them for what happened on January 27, 1967. 3 weeks prior to a scheduled liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center, astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were seated inside their Apollo capsule performing some routine checks. The plan was to go through an entire countdown sequence. A few minor problems delayed the scheduled tests by more than 4 hours. Then at 6:31 p.m., one of the astronauts said to the command center, "Fire! I smell fire." Just 2 seconds later, astronaut White was reported to say, "Fire in the cockpit." Because it was filled with pure oxygen, in a matter of just a few more seconds, a raging fire engulfed the command module cockpit. Due to its intricate design, the escape hatch could not be opened immediately. The severe heat kept technicians on the outside of the module at bay for nearly 5 minutes before they could get the hatch open. By that time, Grissom, White, and Chaffee were dead. It's estimated that they perished within 30 seconds after the fire started from smoke inhalation and severe burns. The nation mourned. NASA was in shock. And the Apollo program was put on hold for nearly 20 months as a meticulous investigation took place to establish the cause of the tragedy. It was determined that sparks from a short under Grissom's seat caused the highly flammable oxygen environment to catch fire and spread in a matter of seconds. There was nothing that anyone could do. Apollo 1, as it was now called, was the space program's first major tragedy. However, the changes made to the Apollo spacecraft as a result of the findings made future missions safer, the spacecraft highly reliable, and trips into outer space nearly routine. Christmas Eve, 1968.
Welcome to the moon, Houston. Thank you.
Apollo 8 carries astronauts Bill Anders, Frank Borman, and Jim Lovell into an orbital flight around the moon. For more than 20 hours, the three travelers make observations about the lunar surface. They took pictures, logged flight information, and sent a live television broadcast from their lunar orbit in which they showed pictures of the Earth and Moon seen from the Apollo 8 spacecraft. Lovell said to the awestruck audience back on Earth, "The vast loneliness is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth." They ended their live broadcast with the crew taking turns reading from the book of Genesis.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw...
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Those were the words heard by millions upon millions of humans as they watched two of their own kind land on the surface of the moon at 4:18 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, July 20th, 1969. 7 hours later, they heard these words spoken by Neil Armstrong, the first person to ever step foot on the surface of another world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A lunar module camera provided live television coverage of Armstrong setting foot on the lunar surface.
Okay, it's quite dark here in the shadow and a little hard for me to see that I have good footing. I'll work my way over into the sunlight here without looking directly into the sun. Okay, it's taut now.
Astronaut Buzz Aldrin emerged soon after, setting foot on the lunar surface at 11:16 p.m., while astronaut Mike Collins remained in orbit above the surface of the moon, ready to dock with Armstrong and Aldrin once their surface mission was complete.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you... For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
The surface exploration was finished in just 2.5 hours when the crew re-entered their lunar module. After a lunar ascent, the lunar module docked with the command and service modules piloted by Collins. The crew transferred into the command and service modules and prepared for the flight back to Earth. Traveling at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, Apollo 11 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean, where they were immediately welcomed as international heroes. The Apollo 11 crew had brought back 47 pounds of lunar surface material ripe for analysis. In exchange for their lunar excavation, the Apollo crew left a plaque on the surface of the moon that simply says, "We came in peace for all mankind." The national aim to land men on the moon and return them safely to Earth had been accomplished. While the rest of the world marveled at the accomplishments of the Apollo 11 astronauts, the Soviets were, for the time being, still operating under a blanket of fierce competition with the United States. On July 13, 1969, the Soviet spacecraft Luna 15 lifted off from Earth, its destination, the surface of the moon. The Russians had secretively timed the robotic mission so that it would land on the moon just as Apollo 11 was blasting off from Earth. However, the Luna 15 spacecraft experienced difficulties and crashed into the moon's surface on July 21, 1969. Had it not failed, the Russian craft would have returned lunar rock and soil samples back to the Earth just hours ahead of the Americans. Even though the Soviets failed, America's contest with the Russian mystery spacecraft added an extra element of suspense to the final race to the moon. Apollo 12 was the second manned mission to land on the moon. The astronauts landed the lunar module within mere walking distance of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft that had landed on the moon in April of 1967. The astronauts brought instruments from the Surveyor 3 spacecraft back to Earth. Scientists used the instruments to examine the effects of long-term exposure to the lunar environment. Then in April 1970, a near tragedy turns out to be one of NASA's finest moments. 55 hours after the launch of Apollo 13, the command center at NASA heard these infamous words.
Houston, we've had a problem.
An oxygen tank on board the ship explodes, rendering the spacecraft crippled.
Got a main B bus undervolt.
You see an AC bus undervolt there, guidance? Or ECOM? Negative, flight. I believe the crew reported it.
We got a main B undervolt.
We may have had an instrumentation problem, flight. Roger.
And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
Astronauts Fred Hayes, Jim Lovell, and Jack Swigert are now adrift in the vastness of outer space with no idea how they're going to get home. The world watches in shock, and NASA gets to work.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got limbs still attached. The limb spacecraft's good, so if we need to get back home, we got a limb to do a good portion of it with. Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that's going to blow our CSM electrical power with the batteries or that will cause us to lose the main or the fuel cell number 2. Okay, we want to keep the O2 and that kind of stuff working. We'd like to have RCS, but we got the command module system, so we're in good shape if we need to get home. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
It was decided to move the 3 astronauts into the lunar module Aquarius that was only designed for 2.
Tell them you from flight. Go ahead, flight. I want you to get some guys figuring out minimum power in the LEM to sustain life.
Next, the 3 men would attempt a complicated loop around the moon using the lunar module's engines that had been intended for the moon landing. Aquarius was cramped and cold, and the men on board encountered several problems after entering the lunar module. The crew at Mission Control worked around the clock to help the astronauts as they struggled to return safely back to Earth.
At the moment, the astronauts are continuing to try to isolate their trouble. The late report says the spacecraft now is operating on battery power alone. All unnecessary equipment is being turned off.
Because of a number of unaccounted for variables, navigating the crippled spacecraft back to Earth became a major challenge. In addition, the astronauts had to fight with rising CO2 levels in their ship, freezing temperatures, loss of power, and instrumentation control. Like the sailors of old, they had to rely on the stars to navigate their way home as billions of people back on Earth monitored the unfolding drama with TV, radio, and newspaper.
Your astronauts will come back safe.
If I may be serious for one moment and ask the entire audience for a moment of prayer for the crewmen of the Apollo 13. We'll hold silence for a moment, please.
Four days after those fearful words, Houston, we've had a problem, filtered through NASA's Mission Control. The entire world breathed a uniform sigh of relief as the astronauts of Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean. Many considered it to be the space program's finest hour.
I recall, Captain, that when I spoke to you on the phone, you said that you regretted that you were unable to complete your mission. I hereby declare that this was a successful mission. From the start, the exploration of space has been hazardous adventure. The voyage of Apollo 13 dramatized its risk. The men of Apollo 13, by their poise and skill under the most intense kind of pressure, epitomized the character that accepts danger and surmounts it. Theirs is the spirit that built America.
Apollo 13 did nothing to deter the American spirit of adventure and exploration. January 31st, 1971 saw the launch of Apollo 14, where in 33 hours on the lunar surface, the American astronauts collected moon rocks for analysis, took photographs, and in one of the space program's most famous and lighthearted moments, astronaut Alan Shepard hit golf balls on the surface of the moon. That same year, the Soviet Union launched Salyut 1, the world's first space station into orbit around the Earth. NASA was impressed, but they had their eyes on other missions. The Apollo program launched 3 more manned missions to the moon, where numerous experiments were conducted, and astronauts even drove the now famous lunar roving vehicle, covering great distances across the lunar surface.
As I step off at the surface at Taurus Littrow, we'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. 99 proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector grid. Ag start.
On December 14, 1972, Eugene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17, became the last man to walk on the moon, and America saw the end of the Apollo program.
Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Take out your 1,500 feet.